The We Say Yes group has launched its campaign to support the government's proposed carbon tax. But despite the backing of former Liberal leader John Hewson, the coalition still remains opposed to the tax. Our political editor Lyndal Curtis spoke to the opposition's climate action spokesman Greg Hunt a short time ago.
Greg Hunt, welcome to News 24.
It's a pleasure.
The coalition's been somewhat critical of the ad campaign that was launched today, the campaign with actors in it, but there were other people in it too. There was a wool grower, there was a bird watcher. Are you critical of their participation?
Our view is to allow anybody to have their view in their own way, and if the acting community wants a voice, then that's entirely up to them, and if that's paid for by the ACTU. It should perhaps contain information about the fact that household electricity bills, petrol bills and gas bills will all go up. But our real beef is with the government, which has a multi-million-dollar ad campaign budgeted, planned, and which the Prime Minister should rule out because it will be a blatantly political exercise. A
blatantly political exercise like John Howard's advertising the GST?
This is our watch and our time and our responsibility, and we took a $50 million cut to the election in advertising budgets. The Prime Minister has a $13.7 million carbon tax ad campaign in her budget to tell Australians that they should be driving up the cost of their own electricity and petrol and gas. We think that's inappropriate. There are genuine public information campaigns, but on our watch at this moment, we think this would be a blatantly political abuse of public funds.
So it's okay to use the GST as an example for taking it to an election, but not use the GST as an example for advertising?
Let me say this. Our watch, our time, our responsibility. I can't speak for the past, I can speak for the present, and what we see now is arguably the most contentious tax reform in Australian history, with, on the latest figures, perhaps 2-to-1 Australians against it, and the Prime Minister will be misusing taxpayers' funds. She was not willing to use ALP funds before the election to argue for a carbon tax. She is now willing to use public funds after an election to argue for that carbon tax.
We've seen submissions from two business groups, the Australian Industry Group and the Business Council of Australia, on the government's carbon price. While both have some concerns about the government's plan, they both say that they want a market-based mechanism to deal with climate change, to deal with greenhouse gas emissions. Does that mean they don't want your plan?
No, I don't accept that characterisation of what they've said. It's very interesting. Both groups were asked to respond within the government's own terms to how they would implement a carbon tax. They have effectively driven a dagger through the heart of the carbon tax. And just this afternoon, the Business Council has released on its website, only a few moments before we came on air, an additional letter making it absolutely clear that the government should consider other mechanisms. That
other market-based mechanisms or other mechanisms like your direct action policy?
Well, ours is a market-based mechanism, but let me make this absolutely clear that the Business Council submission was a dagger to the heart of the government's carbon tax, and this afternoon's letter making it clear that the government should consider other mechanisms is an extraordinary action which throws the government's carbon tax into disarray. It comes on top of the Australian Industry Group, on top of the Minerals Council today pointing to radical changes overseas compared with what the government expected, and on top of the National Farmers Federation saying outright reject the carbon tax.
If I could ask you a couple of questions about your plan.
Sure.
You have said you would pick the lowest cost action. If you had two similar things, one costs the least, one was a bit more expensive but more effective, what would you choose? Where does efficacy rate?
Well, the definition of efficiency here is the lowest cost means of reducing a tonne of carbon. So the indicator for everything is reduction of a tonne of carbon, and our approach would be to choose the lowest cost. We would have an independent regulator to ensure that, and it is remarkably similar to something that Professor Garneau has subsequently picked up and outlined. Little focus has been given to the fact that he has identified a Garneau Australian Farm Fund to give it its sort of colloquial explanation, and I spoke with him, and what he outlined there is a lowest cost approach very similar to ours, because it will be necessary to actually reduce emissions through incentives.
But it's got to be proved to be effective, the most effective of the options?
Well, with great respect, all the different forms of carbon reduction will be equally effective if the definition is measured and verified reduction in a tonne of carbon. The variable is the price of that. So unless there is an independent measurement and verification that there is an actual reduction of a tonne of carbon, a little bit like the way the renewable energy certificates are issued, then something wouldn't get through the door. But assuming that's the case, then we simply go for the lowest cost.
And just a question following up on your 7:30 report interview last week, just to make it clear, electricity prices will not go up under your plan?
We will not add to the cost of electricity.
Even if it means having to introduce subsidies to make sure that does not happen?
Well, our approach is that we would only consider something if it was absolutely clear that it would not add to the cost of electricity. So that's a categorical statement. It's a fundamental position from us, and it compares with the approach of the government to drive up electricity prices by 25%.
Even though moving to gas means a higher price, because gas will cost more than say, brown coal?
Well, we would only deal with it if incentives were built in, and we've said this since the 2nd of February 2010. Incentives were built in to make sure there was no additional impact on electricity prices. It is a good question, and it's the difference between the two approaches. Electricity tax on the one side, incentives and no additional impact on electricity on the other.
Greg Hunt, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.